Good evening. Settle in, breathe, and let this one hold you, dear listeners, wherever you are. Curl up with a cup of something warm. Tonight, you're stepping into history's hidden corners with me. Let the day slip away as we unfold a tale woven from starlight, memory, and a little wonder. We step into Kyoto in 1185, the twilight of the Heian court, the final year of the Genpei War that ushers in a new age of the samurai. Have you ever wondered what happens if you touch an artifact silent for centuries? In the hush of the British Museum, Lyra's fingers find a lacquered comb carved with faint verses. It does not simply stir memory. It opens a doorway. What waits beyond is not just a gallery but a choice, asking quietly what it wants from her. And so the night draws us closer, toward the object that should have slept forever. What if something meant only to rest behind glass was not resting at all, but waiting? In the still halls of the museum, Lyra's footsteps slowed. The air was cool, unchanged no matter the hour. A hush that carried every gilded mask, every weathered fragment, every relic worn by hands lost to centuries. Then she saw it. A lacquered comb. Small enough to overlook, yet brushed with such care that affection still lingered across its surface. She leaned closer. Gold lines traced its curve, and neatly carved verses seemed to catch the dim light like threads of breath. In the Heian court, lacquered combs and delicate inscriptions were treasured markers of beauty, tokens of layered gowns and long perfumed nights. For a moment she thought it was nothing more than that reminder. Then the verses seemed to glimmer faintly, as if the wood might draw breath. Why stir now? And why notice her? Her hand hovered. To touch was to trespass. Yet the room gave nothing back to her hesitation, only her own breath echoing against glass, the low hum of security lights watching from above. Beneath that stillness she felt something else, a presence poised and listening. When her fingers finally brushed the comb, no storm broke loose. She expected a rush, but instead, its magic moved in a whisper. It did not speak in words she knew. It asked within her, quiet as bone. The request startled her with its simplicity. The comb wanted no power offered, no fear surrendered. It pressed only toward the weight she carried too long. The sadness rarely named, folded again and again inside herself. All it asked was release. Lay that down, and it would open, she faltered. Releasing sorrow is harder than closing it tight. We clutch grief as though it proves what we once loved. How could this fragile object know her hollows and aches? Yet the shimmer beneath its verses held a patience that was not demanded, only possibility, a door waiting for her hand. Objects are sometimes called memory resting in matter. This one felt exactly that. Its polished lacquer held more than shine. It carried the warmth of palms that once lifted hair, steadied veils, prepared a face for celebration or mourning. Here was a thing shaped by impermanence, and it seemed to recognize that shape in her. Her thumb settled on the curved back. She let out a long breath. Something within her loosened, not in the comb, but within herself. That was enough. The etched gold brightened, each mark kindling like dawn behind silk curtains. Still no walls shook, no glass burst. The change was subtler. A veil drawn between one room and the next. The comb did not open for power alone. It opened only when its holder was willing to let go of something heavy. The air around her grew warm, edged with salt. Her eyes lifted, and the sterile museum dissolved. Security hums, glass reflections, and white light melted away, like a dream sliding back into dark. The comb still pulsed beneath her palm, steady as a heartbeat, and then went calm. When she opened her eyes again, lanterns glowed along timbered eaves. In the distance, drums trembled. Kyoto, Heian-kyo, rose before her. Not a fragment or echo, but the living city itself, teetering at the end of an era. The comb slipped into quiet again, lighter in her grip, as if the grief she had laid down could no longer cling there. It had not trapped her sorrow. It had honored its shape, and then allowed it to pass. The magic was exacting. The way forward required surrender, not command. Relinquish what weighs heavy, and step through. She had stepped. No will of hers alone could undo that. The city had claimed her in its unfolding present. Dust rose under her modern soles. Voices crowded close. Women bent over steaming rice stalls calling to one another. Children shrilled their games through narrow lanes. Men paused at the edges, speaking in hushed tones of soldiers drawing near. Each sound pressed into her chest with alarming clarity. This was not a spectacle for her eyes alone. The streets, full and fragile, carried songs that might vanish in war's shadow. Lyra's pulse leapt as she realized the comb had not flung her here for an idle dream. Something waited within these lantern-lit paths, something that needed her presence, or at least her witness. A lantern drifted in the night's slow wind, its wick flickering. The comb, pressed close in her hand, no longer crackled with power. Its silence was different now, not muteness, but watchfulness. It had opened once. It might open again, when surrender offered itself once more. That was the measure, not her strength, not her command. Only the courage to release what hurt most. In that hollowed space, time itself eased apart, to let her through. So with the hum of drums in the wind and lantern lights soft across her face, Lyra stood inside a city alive on the very edge of change. And what she heard first was not silence, but voices rising, steady and unshaken. What does a city carry in its breath when it stands on the cusp of an ending? The streets before Lyra unfolded in stillness that did not feel still at all. Kyoto's avenues flickered with lantern light, its wooden facades painted with faint scenes of rivers or cranes, its canals brushed by willow fronds dipping toward the water. Women moved past in gowns of 12-fold silk, the junihito, their weight and color catching like fragments of poetry as they crossed the road. Vermilion, gold, pale moss green, each fold shimmered as if carrying verses. The beauty was undeniable, and yet behind every fold lay a quiet tension. On the surface the capital looked unshaken. Markets buzzed, stalls perfumed with roasted chestnut and rice cakes. Courtiers in tall lacquered caps bowed with slow grace before exchange of words. Monks' chants seeped like evening smoke from temple gates. Still, when Lyra listened closely, she caught edges in the rhythm. Talk cut short when the word soldier surfaced, hands still mid-gesture, as if uncertain which way to turn. This was not panic but hesitancy, like a city holding breath. That silence carried reason. The whispers here belonged to a war not far from the gates. The years between 1180 and 1185 would remember the Genpei War, two clans tightening their grip on destiny, the Taira and the Minamoto, a conflict destined to end the Heian court's long reign of peace and hand the land to warriors. The rumor of fighting was not distant. It was the close pulse of history breaking through. Within the palaces, refinement still held its place. At banquets, nobles polished verses of waka, as if the purity of syllables might steady an uncertain world. Calligraphy brushed across scrolls matched the ink to moonlight. Painted screens glittered with clouds spun in gold and blue. Yet Lyra felt these gestures already tipping toward impermanence, like leaves brightening before the fall. This was beauty bracing against a storm. If you like this warmth, let the scene carry you a little deeper. Children's songs drifted from one street clear and high, while nearby she saw guards shift uneasily, their spears balanced too taut in their fists. Noble women crossed bridges layered in silk while behind them messengers pressed forward on horseback, scrolls clutched tight, eyes sharpened by urgency. The city was living in two registers at once, one of grace, and one of guarded watch. Everywhere, opposites met. Shrines displayed fresh verses for a festival pinned lightly in the wind. Words meant to honor seasons, not swords. Yet just beyond the shrine's wooden frame, she overheard merchants lowering their voices to share whispers of camps growing too near. Gardens still gleamed, their pathways swept in quiet preparation, but Lyra glimpsed mothers guiding children inward, not in hysteria but in readiness. Kyoto itself seemed to her alive, a character bearing the weight of its name, the capital of peace and tranquility, and yet, beneath it, the ache of change. She breathed in incense thread from temple doors, and the cool trace of river air rolling down from the camo. She felt the city pulsing with two truths at once, carved with elegance, yet restless with unease at what must come. This atmosphere struck her deeply. She recognized in it an echo of her own unsettled heart, the same unease she had carried forward from loss. Change had pressed into her own life, heavy with silence. She had not known how to let it move through her. Now she stood in a place holding that same tension, a city looking luminous even in the moment before breaking. Along the Kamo River, she paused. The water flowed calm and patient, the surface trembling with lantern fire. Above it, clouds had drawn together, dark folds lengthening across the sky like warning cloth. A crane arced overhead, its whiteness clear even in dimming light. Below its shadow, people slowed steps, and conversations faltered again. Lyra felt then that even the land was poised, still, and listening. The meaning pressed in on her. The war would reshape not simply rulers but time itself. This was the Heian court's last radiance, the samurai's dawn already climbing. She did not need a history text to understand. She could feel it inside the rhythms of walk and voice around her. A dynasty's refinement hung by a thread of seasons. And yet, what held her as she walked deeper was not only grandeur or fragility, but a sense of invitation. Whose eyes might meet hers? Who might read her as she was no native, no loyalist of any clan? The unknown pressed close, carrying risk she could not map. As she slowed near the arch of a wooden gate, she saw the figure waiting. Upright, motion composed, presence quiet yet steady. A sword rested at her side, but tucked beneath her arm was a narrow scroll. Lyra felt her breath still as she took in the contradiction. The mark of one who was both blade-bearer and keeper of words. A soldier, yes, but also something else, something softer. The city seemed almost a step back then, as though it had placed them deliberately at one another's threshold. Dust in the lantern light shifted between them. Behind, the market sounds dimmed in her perception, and before her everything sharpened. EMI stood there, though Lyra did not yet know her name, her gaze carrying both guarded strength and quiet gentleness. The moment held itself. Kyoto, cracked with beauty and dread, seemed to press Lyra toward this meeting. She felt the weight of verse and steel already entwined in the figure before her, and it was here the night began to ask her another question. Not of the city, nor of the war, but of the way strength and softness might live together, if they could, in the same hand. Her name was Hemi. That was the first thing I learned, spoken softly, as lantern smoke curled between us. She did not arrive with noise or swagger. She carried herself as though weight and silence were allies. A sword rested at her hip, sharp against the glow, while beneath her arm she held a scroll. I remember thinking it was that pairing, metal and ink, that caught at me. One belonged to survival, the other to memory. Together they looked less like opposites than like two halves of a steady rhythm. I had always believed strength demanded a hard skin. In my own time, tenderness felt dangerous, as if to admit vulnerability was to slip into weakness. But as I walked beside EMI, I saw no fracture. Here was someone who carried a blade and a brush without apology, as if each belonged to the other. A clenched fist was not her only proof of strength. We did not begin with words. The crowd bent quietly aside, leaving the space that allowed us to meet. When her gaze found mine, it was not with suspicion. There was no measuring stare, only a calm stillness that made me breathe easier, as if the city had placed us together on purpose. Side by side, our steps fell into rhythm. I noticed a dark stain of ink along her fingers, faint but permanent. It told me she spent her hours not only in training, but in scribing, shaping lines even when the night was deep. That detail sank deeper than her sword's flash. It was proof that words lived inside her, as constant as the steel she wore. There was a moment when I nearly laughed, not aloud, but inside my chest, because of how quickly recognition bloomed, as though I had stumbled not upon a stranger, but an answer. I was more than her stance. She was both a protector and a dreamer. And that combination tugged at me with a sharp kind of hope. We walked until she paused beside a stone wall where children had left petals. The sky had pooled into dark indigo, heavy as if it might fall with rain. She unrolled her scroll. When she read, her voice was unhurried, low and clear, as if planting each word into the air like seeds. I did not follow each syllable, but I felt the current of it. A verse about transience, about the ache of beauty already fading. It was not for me. It was not for any gathered ear. It was for her, a moment of shelter she made with her own voice. She rolled the parchment closed again, tying it carefully, and then adjusted the balance of her weapon. That small shift spoke louder than any justification. A warrior who read by lantern glow was not a rare accident. She was a continuation of something deeper. Poetry was woven through the court's life in this era. To exchange verses was as expected as bowing. Even men who carried arms could feel that pull, because beauty and words bound themselves to status in Heian Kyoto. EMI showed me that poetry was not separable from duty. She carried both without fracture. I found myself clutching at that thought. I had spent so long convincing myself I had to bury grief to seem resilient. I feared my tenderness made me lesser. But here was proof otherwise. She moved through the night unbroken, sword and poem side by side, teaching me by the shape of her presence that vulnerability was not a wound. It was part of how you held steady. Perhaps you felt it too. That quiet suspicion that if you let sadness slip through your voice, someone will mistake it for weakness. I carried that fear like a stone. Standing with EMI, I felt it loosen. I remember thinking, she might be the guide I had not known how to ask for. She could not only shield me from danger, she could show me how to breathe with both ache and strength in the same chest. Our connection did not strike like thunder. It threaded itself low and steady, as recognition more than revelation. Two people are aware of how memory presses heavy, and how words ease that weight. It felt like a mirror warped in just the right way, enough to reveal the truth I had hidden from myself. By night's deeper hour, the streets had thinned, torches burned harder, and I smelled oil carried in the damp air. I kept my stride aligned with hers, close enough to feel the quiet force she carried. Every shift of her hand, every balance of scroll and scabbard, steadied me, and I knew for certain then. She was not an accident. The comb had led me here. I felt the city lean closer around us, whispering through the lamps and shutters. Shadows gathered, edged with something restless. The hush before movement, before rumor shook itself into sound. And I knew the calm we shared could not last. Something waited in the dark, pressing toward us. Later that night, when the breath of Kyoto thickened with unease, we were already listening. The streets had grown more narrow, The voices had dropped low. Rumors moved like smoke too close to catch. A storm of steps was coming down the avenues, and we, alone together, would have to answer it. The mission revealed itself in darkness, carried more in whispers than in orders. The night pressed heavily with unease, and words slipped between households like smoke. Soldiers would soon move through Kyoto's perfectly aligned boulevards, the very grid that made the city proud, also making it impossible to vanish. EMI stood quiet, her jaw fixed, and I understood without her saying so. It was not only noble houses or shrines at risk, but families, and among them the smallest children, who could not defend themselves against the storms closing in. The plan did not fall from command. It took shape through Emi's steadiness, a gravity that drew me in. She led me down side lanes few outsiders would know, her posture straight, her stride controlled. There were houses pressed close to one another, where women hurried to gather meager belongings into bundles, and frightened children clung to sleeves without crying out. Their restraint said everything. They already sensed how fragile silence was. I had no weapon, nothing but the lacquer comb hidden beneath my sleeve, its presence a secret press against my skin. EMI carried steel, yes, but more than that she carried knowledge of these lanes, of which corridors bent into shadow and which alleys bent into light. This was her city's rhythm, a grid she read as naturally as a poet reading meter. My role was smaller, to follow, to steady, to take a hand when one trembled more than it should. Still, every damp palm I gripped seemed to insist I was part of this crossing, whether or not I felt worthy. Lanterns swayed in the wind, flames thinning to slivers, then blooming again. Even fire seemed to share our fear of being seen. Kyoto's ordered streets, planned centuries before, gave advantage to troops. But its narrow cuts between temples, its gridded seams tucked against storehouses, might hold safety, if we moved with care. I moved, as though she had practiced this her entire life, a daughter of stone walls and night watches, her sword lowered so it would not intimidate the little ones at her side. That was when the comb stirred, kneeling to comfort a child, my voice low enough to sound like breath. I felt its faint quiver against my wrist. The cause struck clear. It responded not to command, but to choice, to release. In that moment, the fear I held most, the fear of being an intruder in this fragile history, knit itself tight in my chest. But when I exhaled slowly and unclenched its hold, the comb's hum deepened. And as it did, the alley ahead opened empty, a watchman's head turning another way at the exact instant we passed. Not a miracle. Not mastery. Just one danger eased when I stopped clutching dread like a shield. We pressed forward, each footstep stretching time thin. Rain left from earlier dripped from roof tiles with eerie precision, like nails tapping. The smell of smoke threaded through the wood beams, sharp and unsettled. The mothers held tightly to their infants, their breaths quick and shallow. Every minor sound seemed magnified. A door creaking, shingles shifting, a sandal crunching on the gravel. With each I nearly flinched at the thought of it betraying us. Then came the burst of danger. A soldier's silhouette appeared down the broader road, armor bright though the night was dim. EMI moved first. Her body widened, a calm shield between him and the smallest child. My instincts felt slower, simpler. I crouched close to the boy at her side, murmuring breathy words I hoped would still be his trembling. For a heartbeat, the soldier seemed certain to turn toward us. My pulse struck painfully in my ears. Step. Another step. His movement slowed. A pause. Then a call drew him away. Unseen. Perhaps trivial, but decisive. He turned. His shoulders shifted from us. We did not breathe until he was gone. Danger ebbed for a moment. and pulse-pounding silence flooded back in. Suspense hung sharp at every corner of the rooftops. And yet I realized it was not mine to carry alone. Emmy's vigilance shared the weight. The mother's endurance carried the rest. When I stopped treating this burden as singular, it became survivable. We slipped near temples where the stillness was monumental. The bells, great bronze mouths looming above, might have betrayed us if stirred, but they did not. I caught myself imagining the calamity of a toll rolling through the night, and I let that thought go. Instantly the comb responded, quiet but stabilizing, and the bells seemed to rest heavier, deeper in their silence. Again and again it taught me, when I eased my grip on fear, space opened. Step by step, we reached further from the city center. Woodhouses thinned into simpler dwellings, roofs lower, walls quieter. At last, a courtyard waited. A cluster of homes pressed close together, spared for now from marching lines. Women sank into relief, clutching children too tired to weep. For the first time, I could feel stillness, not as a risk but as shelter. No words of thanks were demanded. Emi bowed lightly, her face still measured despite the relief that circled us. I saw swells of gratitude rise and quiet in the chests of those around, too deep to stitch into words. My role had been small compared to hers. All I had carried was quiet comfort and the act of loosening fear, but even that had kept the comb glowing at my sleeve. Enough. I held it, cooling now, its hum faded. The lesson lingered. It had not made me powerful. It reminded me that surrender could be strength. That shared trust, not grasping force, created the narrow path of survival. The cluster hushed, children falling into uneasy dreams. Emi still stood near me, her presence calm, her breath steady after long watchfulness. My heart, though lighter, ached at the knowledge pressing forward. This rescue was not the ending. It was only a brief space between. And in that space, with quiet wrapped close around us, something softer began to take shape. The rescue was behind them. But the night lingered, not yet ready to release its hold. Emi and Lyra found themselves in a courtyard, pressed between low walls, the air damp, with the trace of earlier rain. The families they had guided were safe in nearby houses. Here, silence shifted its shape. It was no longer edged with danger but steadier, almost sheltering. The urgency of the streets had not vanished. It clung faintly, like smoke that takes hours to leave the air. Yet beneath the branches above them, with their faint rustle, that alarm quieted. They sat near one another without words, knowing time would press forward regardless. Behind Lyra's stillness, she felt the comb's quiet patience, never demanding, but never absent either. Its presence reminded her this was not rest alone. It was a pause before change. Emi unrolled a slip of parchment, though it held no ink. Instead she recited words already etched into her mind. They were simple, fragile lines about rain weighing over blossoms, fragrance breathing out before vanishing in the morning sun. Lyra listened, and the meaning struck her. Beauty is beautiful because it slips away. They spoke nothing of love. They didn't need to. The verse was its own confession, spoken not for display, but because the moment itself required honesty. To be invited into that tenderness, into poetry held privately in memory, was to be held without arms, steadied without shield. It was an embrace built of trust. For Lyra, softness had long felt forbidden. In her own world, to yield, to reveal, to let someone too close, had always risked being undone. Here, in this courtyard, it felt different. A single poem held between them glowed brighter than defenses she had kept for years. Emotion rose inside her not as weakness but as proof. being seen did not wound her. It steadied her. The comb stirred faintly against her wrist. A reminder, not a summons. That she had not been led here simply to linger, but to learn. At the edge of her thoughts pressed the ache of knowing this could not continue unchanged. Time was moving. Their closeness would soon exist only as memory. She recognized the feeling now, its name whispered from the culture surrounding her. In Heian thought, what some call mono no aware asterisk. Beauty and sorrow sit together because everything ends. Emmy's verse was the embodiment of it, fragile but full. Emmy's smile caught her then, soft, barely forming in the corners of her mouth, but it turned the moment sacred. In that look, Lyra heard the unspoken question. Was it truly worth it, to give your heart to something fleeting? The air held wet stone, the scent of blossoms fading, her pulse too quick for calm. She answered within herself, yes. Worth it precisely because it would not last longer. Even as she cherished it, the question pressed harder. Could she carry this as gift, rather than cling to it like a wound? Could she let it live forward as memory, instead of grasping at its present form? She thought of what weighed in her chest, and she named it, the memory of being left behind. The fear of holding something too tightly and watching it shatter anyway. She chose to release that. To set it down, here. The comb warmed fully as though affirming her clarity. Its hum tightened into her pulse. The rule was clear now. It did not answer her desires. It answered her act of release. The balance it demanded was not clinging, but gratitude. Suspense circled them as she recognized the choice. She could attempt to cling, to resist inevitability. Or she could acknowledge impermanence. EMI, sensing that turn in the air, placed her hand gently over Lyra's. Not claim, not plea. Simply confirmation that what they had shared was real. Relief arrived in the form of a single tear. Not despair, but the softness of knowing she had risked openness and survived it. Love did not need years to matter. Sometimes a single night carved deeper for being brief. Every breath heightened because it would end. Gratitude rose, fierce and gentle all at once. Lyra whispered thanks, her voice trembling but anchored. EMI nodded, her palm slipping away, wrapping instead around the parchment that would never be inked, but had already written itself inside memory. The comb answered no longer softly but firmly. Not violent, only steady. A tide that could not be resisted, carrying her toward its next threshold. It was the price and the gift. She had let go, and so the path ahead would open. The courtyard deepened, lamplight dimming as if the night itself leaned closer. Emi's outline blurred into the fabric of remembrance, not lost but folded into it. Lyra closed her eyes. She carried the poem, the touch, the stillness. They were hers, even as the air thinned into a different silence. And then the weight shifted around her, the sound of a museum hush beginning to return. She felt both ache and release, grief and gratitude knotted together in her chest. She had learned what the comb meant to teach, that letting go could itself be love. And this thought stayed with her as the next moment gathered. What, she wondered, does one carry back from a love you cannot keep? You may wonder what you keep when a night like that slips behind glass once more. Lyra stood again in the British Museum, the hush of its midnight vastness around her. The air felt cool, carrying no trace of rain or lanterns, no hint of Kyoto streets. Before her, in its case, the lacquered comb lay still, dark, polished, faint verses etched but unlit. The wood bore no hum, no heartbeat, only stillness. Yet within her, there was a settled difference. All around, the museum breathed its nocturnal rhythm. By day its galleries echoed with stepping feet and 1,000 fragmented voices. Now, silence reigned instead, broken only by the faint thrum of lights shining down in pale focus. Spotlights clung to artifacts like guardians, their beams protecting fragments of far-off times. Beyond those small circles, shadows pulled thick. The quiet pressed deeper than absence of sound. It shifted like a presence, reminding her she was not meant to linger here, yet cradling her all the same. She drew closer to the case, and her reflection hovered faint across the glass. Once, its surface had felt like a path, opening into a city with voices and tenderness intact. Tonight it looked impenetrable, the comb no different from what a passerby in daylight might see. Lacquer, craft, nothing more. The contrast made her pause. What once carried her beyond time now lay as silent as any carved stone. Even still, inside her own frame she felt storm-soaked, filled with what had passed across her hands. The family's clutching children, the press of their trust as they followed into the shadows, the warning hush of soldiers. She carried EMI most of all, the steel steady at her side, the scroll of unspoken words, the warmth of a smile that had asked no promise but gave it shelter freely. She carried Kyoto itself, luminous even in fear, trembling with change, all that lived within her chest now, though the London night beyond the walls had not shifted at all. As she laid her palm gently to the glass, the comb did not stir. No shimmer drew itself alive, but her pulse told her the truth. It had never been about magic as spectacle. Its gift was never to erase loss, never to restore. It had shown her how to unclench, how to set down the hidden stone she had carried too long. And in that release, it had returned her not empty, but lighter. The cases rose all around her, their stillness profound. Each artifact carried a story, held like breath waiting through centuries of silence. The museum held objects that her memory made solid. This comb returned her not with restoration, but with a second chance. Its threshold was not only into Kyoto, it was into her own capacity to see grief and beauty hand in hand, and still walk forward. She breathed deeply, leaning close once more. The verses, etched like frozen rivers, no longer glimmered with light but folded into shadow. Even so, their meaning unfolded differently now. They no longer seemed to cling to what was lost, but smiled quietly toward what could yet come. That was the true shimmer. Chance itself, fragile but real. She turned her gaze across the gallery. Tall glass cases loomed like silent towers, the polished marble below reflecting the pale wash of spotlights. Bronze gleamed faintly, marble faces held their distant expressions. None of them changed for her. But everything in her way of seeing had shifted. She carried them now as one carries a folded map in a coat pocket. A map does not alter the land itself, but it offers placement, orientation, paths unseen the first time. That was what the comb had become. No longer a doorway, but a guide. She let her breath out in a soft whisper, gratitude threading through it. Grateful for the comb, yes, but also for the quiet body of the museum itself, for the way its walls had steadied her within departure, and now steadied her in return. No crowd to witness, only her own thanks dissolving into the hush around columns and marble. These artifacts, she realized, were not relics alone. They were mirrors, prisms, waiting to hold the reflections of those still alive, reminding her that endings do not erase, endings reshape. The comb shone as only lacquer should, glossy, calm, unyielding. No spell stirred, no glow formed. That silence was no disappointment. It was enough. She understood now. She did not need it to open again. The second chance had already been given. She stepped back from the glass, each footfall brushing gently across the stone hall. This was still the British Museum. Vast, hushed, both a refuge and a threshold. She knew there could be another doorway someday, if the choice called for it. And if so, she would be ready. The gallery deepened again, light falling in quiet bands. She lingered a moment longer, while the hush wrapped soft around her shoulders. That stillness invited rest, not suspense. Tonight was enough. And with that thought, the silence carried her forward, toward the truth that release, not clinging, was the shape strength would now take. Strength does not come from holding on without end. It rises when a hand opens, when a heart softens its grip. The Heian poets called this awareness mono no aware asterisk, a tenderness toward things precisely because they fade, a sensibility the Heian court taught through its poetry and arts. Lyra's journey showed that release is not erasure but an opening. Perhaps you too carry something waiting to be set down. In the quiet you might feel the weight ease as you breathe. In that softened space, second chances wait gently. Let this moment be your last thought before sleep.